My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 38 years old, and I work as a payroll supervisor for a regional construction company outside Columbus, Ohio. Numbers have always made sense to me. Families never did. 2 weeks before everything finally changed, my 10-year-old son, Ethan, spent 3 straight evenings making a thank you card for his grandmother. He folded the cream-colored paper into a perfect rectangle, glued pressed maple leaves along the border, and practiced writing, "Thank you for always bringing us together," until every letter looked steady. At exactly 6:42 p.m. on a Thursday, one notification on my phone quietly destroyed all the love he'd poured into that card. I didn't know it then, but 14 days later I'd be standing in my own backyard, holding a small silver reservation card over a fire pit before letting it drift into the flames. What happened that night wasn't really about an expensive steak. It was about the invisible rules my family had followed for years without anyone daring to name them until one child was finally excluded so completely that pretending became impossible. Every Labor Day weekend, my parents hosted what they proudly called the Bennett Legacy Dinner. It always took place at the same downtown steakhouse with white tablecloths, leather chairs, and framed photographs of local athletes on the walls. My father reserved the private dining room every August, and my mother insisted every grandchild receive a printed silver reservation card with their name embossed across the front. She treated those cards like invitations to royalty. She even saved extras inside a wooden keepsake box lined with green velvet. Looking back, those little silver cards represented more than dinner reservations. They represented rank. The favorite grandchildren always received theirs first. The others waited. Some years they arrived in the mail. Some years they were handed over after church. The order never changed. I noticed. I simply convinced myself it didn't matter. Ethan was different from his cousins in ways that had nothing to do with personality. He loved building birdhouses with scrap wood behind our garage. He read library books about planets instead of playing video games for hours. Every Saturday morning, he made pancakes shaped like animals because he believed breakfast should look happy before it tasted good. He never demanded attention. If another child wanted the last cookie, Ethan usually smiled and said, "It's okay. I'll have half." I used to think that kindness would naturally be rewarded. Instead, it often became permission for people to overlook him. The hardest truth I've ever admitted isn't that my family mistreated my son. It's that I spent years translating their behavior into something easier to live with. They're just busy. They didn't mean it. They'll do better next time. Those excuses became habits. Habits became traditions. This Labor Day felt different, though. I made sure there could be no misunderstandings. On Tuesday, August 18th, I texted my mother our attendance. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji and, "Looking forward to seeing everyone." On Friday afternoon, she emailed the family schedule, listing dinner for Sunday at 6:30 p.m. I answered, "Claire plus Ethan confirmed." My older sister, Melissa, even replied beneath my message with, "See you both there." The following Monday, during my niece Ava's swim lesson, my mother asked Ethan whether he decided between the ribeye and the fillet. 3 other parents stood nearby when she asked. Ethan grinned and answered, "The ribeye. Mom says I'm finally old enough." Everything seemed settled. Still, while gathering her folding chair from beside the pool, my mother smiled that careful smile she'd worn for years and casually said, "Well, not everything has to be equal." I laughed because I always laughed. I assumed she meant dessert portions or who sat beside Grandpa. I had heard that sentence so many times it barely registered anymore. If someone had stopped me right there and asked what that sentence had really meant in our family, I don't think I could have answered honestly. Not yet. Sunday arrived warm and bright, the kind of late summer afternoon that made everything feel slower than usual. At 5:17 p.m., while Ethan was carefully sliding his handmade thank you card into a large white envelope, my phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. It was a screenshot from my younger cousin Natalie. No message. Just the reservation confirmation from Hawthorne Steakhouse. I looked once. Then again. The reservation listed every grandchild by name beneath each pre-ordered meal. Ava, dry-aged ribeye, $120. Lucas, filet mignon, $120. Mason, Harper, Lily, Noah. 6 names. I read through them 3 times before the absence finally became louder than every name on the page. Ethan wasn't there. At first I assumed there had been a mistake. I immediately called my mother. She answered on the second ring, sounding more annoyed than surprised. "I think the restaurant left Ethan off the reservation," I said. There was a pause. "No," she replied calmly. "The reservation is correct." I honestly thought I'd misheard her. "What do you mean it's correct?" "He isn't coming. You asked him what steak he wanted less than a week ago." I changed my mind. I felt the kitchen become strangely quiet. Ethan was only a few feet away, coloring another tiny maple leaf onto the corner of his card, completely unaware that the conversation was about him. "Why?" I asked. My mother's answer came without hesitation. "Not everything has to be equal." There it was again. The sentence I'd laughed at for years suddenly sounded less like a family saying and more like a verdict. I asked if the restaurant had run out of seats. No. I asked whether money was tight. No. I asked whether Ethan had done something wrong. No. So why is he the only grandchild staying home? She sighed, as though I were asking an unreasonable question. Some children appreciate these traditions more than others. Ethan will be fine. Then she ended the call. I stood there staring at the silverware drawer because I couldn't make myself look toward my son. The thank you card was still open on the table. The envelope waited beside it. The screenshot on my phone glowed beside both of them, and somehow those 3 objects looked like they belonged to entirely different families. Ethan finally noticed my face. "What happened?" I tried to smile. "It looks like Grandma made a mistake." He nodded once. "Can we fix it?" "I don't know." He didn't cry. That almost broke me more than if he had. He picked up the envelope, carefully removed the card he'd spent 3 evenings making, folded it in half, and placed it back inside his backpack. "I'll save it," he said quietly. "Maybe next year." Children shouldn't know how to prepare themselves for disappointment that efficiently. After he walked upstairs, memories I hadn't invited came rushing in one after another. The Christmas when every grandchild received bicycles except Ethan, who got a board game because my mother said he was more thoughtful. The family beach trip where every cousin had matching hoodies except him because his size had supposedly been forgotten. The birthday party where the group photograph was taken before we arrived even though we'd been delayed by a highway accident everyone already knew about. The science fair where my father promised to come, then left after 15 minutes because Ava had a soccer game across town. Each memory had seemed small by itself. Each one came with an explanation. Each one had been easy enough to excuse. Together, they formed something I could no longer pretend not to see. I hadn't just been another victim standing beside my son. I'd been translating cruelty into inconvenience. I'd told him not to take things personally. I'd explained away forgotten invitations. I'd taught him patience when what he really deserved was protection. That realization settled heavier than the reservation itself. I wasn't only angry with my parents. For the first time, I was ashamed of myself. I called my sister Melissa first. She listened quietly before saying, "Claire, don't make this a thing. Mom probably has her reasons." "What reason justifies excluding one 10-year-old? You're focusing on the wrong part. If you push this, Labor Day will become about drama instead of family." Family. Apparently, that word had room for everyone except my son. I hung up and called my father. Surely he didn't know. Surely he would fix it. Instead, he sounded tired. "Your mother already explained it to me. And I'd just let it go if I were you." "Dad, Ethan is the only grandchild who isn't invited. It's one dinner." "No," I answered quietly. "It's 10 years. He didn't respond. A few seconds later, he simply wished me a good evening before ending the call. I sat alone at the kitchen table while Ethan quietly worked upstairs, pretending everything was normal. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking whether my family loved us. I started asking whether I'd mistaken tolerance for love all along. The next morning, I stopped trying to figure out how to convince my family that Ethan deserved a seat at their table. That sentence surprised me more than anyone else. For nearly 10 years, every disagreement had followed the same pattern. I explained. I compromised. I apologized for things that weren't my fault. Then I accepted whatever scraps of peace were left. This time, something felt different. I wasn't fighting over a steak. I was fighting over whether my son believed he belonged. And I suddenly realized that belonging could never be negotiated. It had to be built. I looked at the silver reservation card my mother had mailed to our house weeks earlier. Ethan's name had never been printed on it because one had never been intended for him. It was simply a blank sample card she sometimes included for decorations, something she'd once called extra stationery. I placed it on the kitchen table. Then I opened my laptop. Instead of searching for another way into my parents' dinner, I reserved the community pavilion at Maple Creek Park for the same Sunday evening. It wasn't elegant. There were picnic tables instead of white linens, string lights instead of chandeliers, and charcoal grills instead of professional chefs. But there was room. As many seats as we needed. I intentionally left one folding chair empty near the middle of the tables. Not because I expected my mother to come. Because I wanted to know that if she ever chose kindness over pride, there would already be a place waiting for her. That chair wasn't for punishment. It was for possibility. I caught myself smiling for the first time in almost 24 hours. Sometimes peace isn't found inside the old room. Sometimes you build another room entirely. Before inviting anyone, I tried writing to my mother. My first draft lasted exactly 3 sentences. Asterisk, you should be ashamed of yourself. Someday, you'll wonder why Ethan never calls you. Asterisk. I stared at it for a full minute before deleting every word. The second draft wasn't much better. Asterisk, congratulations. You finally proved there's a price tag on your love. Asterisk. Delete. Neither message would help Ethan. Both would only satisfy my anger for a few minutes. So I started over. I wrote. Asterisk, we've decided not to attend the Labor Day dinner. Instead, Ethan and I will be hosting our own cookout at Maple Creek Park at 6 p.m. Anyone who wants to spend time together is sincerely welcome. There are no assigned seats, no expectations, and no hard feelings. We'd simply love to share a meal with anyone who wishes to come. Asterisk. I read it twice. There were no accusations. No debate. No scorekeeping. I press send. Less than 5 minutes later, my mother replied. Asterisk, suit yourself. Asterisk. 2 words. Nothing more. It was amazing how much coldness could fit inside 12 letters. For a brief moment, I wondered if no one would come. Maybe everyone would choose the expensive steakhouse. Maybe Ethan and I would end up eating hamburgers alone under a public pavilion. If that happened, I had already decided I wouldn't regret it. At least my son would never again wonder whether he had been invited. Sunday evening arrived. At 5:40 p.m., Ethan stood beside one of the charcoal grills wearing my late grandfather's oversized canvas apron. It hung nearly to his ankles, and he kept rolling the sleeves back because they covered his hands. What if nobody comes? He asked. I answered honestly. Then we'll still have the best burgers in Ohio. He laughed. 5 minutes later, my neighbor Mrs. Alvarez walked over carrying homemade potato salad. Then Ethan's 5th grade teacher arrived with fresh lemonade. Coach Daniels from Little League showed up with his wife. My cousin Natalie came carrying 2 folding tables because she said the pavilion looked too empty without them. By 6:15, nearly 30 people filled the park. Children chased one another across the grass. Someone brought a speaker that quietly played old Motown songs. A retired firefighter insisted on teaching Ethan the proper way to judge when charcoal was ready. Nobody asked who was important. Nobody counted grandchildren. Nobody compared invitations. Everyone simply pulled up another chair whenever someone new arrived. Around 7 o'clock, Coach Daniels handed Ethan a pair of grilling tongs. Your turn. Most 10-year-olds would have been nervous. Ethan wasn't. He carefully checked each steak with the meat thermometer we'd packed from home, asked everyone how they liked theirs cooked, and remembered every single order without writing anything down. Medium rare. Medium. Well done. Extra mushrooms. No butter. He moved calmly from one end of the grill to the other, smiling every time someone thanked him. Mrs. Alvarez leaned toward me and whispered, "That young man notices everybody." I swallowed hard. Yes, he always had. People were simply noticing him now. Later that evening, Natalie quietly sat beside me while Ethan helped serve dessert. I probably shouldn't tell you this, she said. You don't have to. I think you should know. She explained that the dinner at Hawthorne Steakhouse hadn't gone the way my mother expected. The private dining room looked beautiful. The steaks were expensive. The conversation never really started. Several people noticed Ethan's empty place before the appetizers even arrived. My youngest nephew had apparently asked, "Why isn't Ethan here?" Nobody answered immediately. The silence lingered longer than anyone liked. My father barely touched his fillet. Melissa spent most of dinner looking at her phone. Even the waiter reportedly asked whether another guest was still coming because one place setting remained unused. It wasn't ruined. It was simply empty. The absence my mother had tried to hide had become the most noticeable person in the room. I didn't feel victorious hearing that. I felt sad. Because elegant tables can still feel lonely when someone important was intentionally left away from them. As everyone packed leftovers into containers, Ethan walked over carrying the old canvas apron folded neatly across his arms. I had fun, he said. I know. Do you think we can do this again next year? I looked around at the mismatched lawn chairs, paper plates, half-finished pies, children laughing beneath the string lights, and adults who had stayed long after sunset simply because they enjoyed being together. Yes, I answered. We absolutely can. Driving home later that night, I realized something I hadn't understood before. Winning never feels as satisfying as finally stopping the fight you were never supposed to have. Still, I couldn't pretend there wasn't a cost. I had spent 38 years believing my family would eventually become the people I'd always defended. Letting go of that hope felt like grieving someone who was still alive. A few days later, my Aunt Denise called. She didn't defend my mother. She didn't excuse her. But she quietly said something that stayed with me. Your mother grew up earning affection instead of receiving it. She mistakes favoritism for love because that's how love was measured in her childhood. I sat with those words for a long time. They explained her. They didn't excuse her. Pain can explain a wound. It should never become permission to pass the knife. And for the first time since that reservation screenshot arrived at exactly 5:17 p.m., I believed the future might finally belong to Ethan instead of the old rules that had nearly convinced him he didn't deserve a seat at the table. Exactly 2 weeks after Labor Day, at 4:11 p.m. on a Friday, my doorbell rang. I looked through the front window before opening it. My mother stood on the porch holding a white bakery box with both hands. She wasn't dressed the way she usually was for family visits. No jewelry except her wedding ring. No carefully chosen scarf. Just a plain navy sweater and the expression of someone who had rehearsed a conversation too many times. I didn't rush to answer. She had made Ethan wait long enough. She could wait 3 minutes on my porch. When I finally opened the door, she started with the same confidence I'd heard my entire life. I think this has gone on long enough. I didn't step aside. She tried again. People are talking. Your cousins think this family is falling apart. There it was. Reputation first. Always reputation first. I simply said, people started talking when one little boy disappeared from your reservation. For the first time, she had no immediate response. She shifted the bakery box from one hand to the other. Then she reached for guilt. I've barely seen my grandson in 2 weeks. I nodded. That was your decision before it became mine. Another silence. The old tactics had always worked because I used to fill every silence by apologizing. This time, I let the quiet do its work. Finally, her shoulders lowered. She looked older than I remembered. Not weaker. Just tired. Then she asked something I never expected to hear. Does he still think I don't love him? It wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It sounded frightened. I answered as honestly as I could. I've never told him you don't love him. She looked relieved for half a second. Then I continued. I told him I don't know whether you know how to love him fairly. The words landed between us without either of us trying to soften them. She looked toward the driveway where Ethan's bicycle lay on its side after school. I want to fix this. I believed she meant it. Wanting wasn't enough anymore. You don't owe me an apology, I said. You owe one to a 10-year-old boy who's spent 3 evenings making you a thank you card for a dinner he was never invited to. She nodded slowly. I'll apologize. Not because you want everyone else to move on. Another nod. Because he deserves the truth. She asked if she could see him. I called Ethan downstairs. When he reached the hallway, he looked first at me, not at his grandmother. I gave him the choice with my eyes. He quietly nodded. The three of us sat in the living room for only a moment before Ethan asked if they could talk on the back patio. I watched them step outside. The old wooden swing creaked gently as they sat down together. I never opened the door. I never listened. Some conversations belong only to the people who survive them. I saw my mother wipe her eyes once. I saw Ethan hand her something from his pocket. Much later I learned it was the thank you card he'd never given her. He had kept it all that time. When they came back inside nearly 20 minutes later, neither of them explained what had been said. Neither needed to. Some healing becomes smaller when strangers demand to hear every word. A few months passed. Thanksgiving arrived. Then Christmas. By the following Labor Day, nobody mentioned Hawthorne Steakhouse. Nobody suggested another private dining room. Nobody ordered $120 steaks. Instead, everyone gathered at Maple Creek Park again. The charcoal grills were already warming when we arrived. Children carried folding chairs instead of waiting for assigned seats. Each family brought one favorite dish. Dessert came before dinner because the youngest grandchildren voted for it. No one argued. My mother arrived carrying homemade peach cobbler. She didn't ask where she should sit. She simply chose an empty chair like everyone else. Halfway through the evening, I noticed something that almost made me cry. Without announcing it, she walked over to Ethan just before dinner and handed him a small silver reservation card. His name was embossed across the front. Nothing fancy. Just one line. Reserved for Ethan. He smiled, turned the card over once, then slipped it into the pocket of my late grandfather's old canvas apron before walking back to the grill. He didn't frame it. He didn't hold it up for everyone to see. He simply accepted it and got back to making sure every person received exactly what they'd asked for. Medium rare. Medium. Well done. Nobody was served last. Nobody was forgotten. Watching him move from person to person, I realized the silver reservation card no longer represented rank. It represented welcome. My mother never again said, "Not everything has to be equal." She didn't need to. The way she quietly waited her turn in line beside everyone else said far more than those words ever could. Today, the original silver card I almost burned sits inside Ethan's memory box beside the thank you card and a photograph from that first park cookout. Not as proof of what our family broke. As proof of what we finally rebuilt. Because families aren't measured by who receives the $120 steak, who arrives at 6:30 p.m., or who sits in the private dining room. They're measured by whether every child knows, without ever having to ask, that there's already a seat waiting at the table for them.